Today, Hamas accepted the very same Egyptian framework that it rejected a month ago. Ultimately, so much bloodshed could have been avoided.
But Hamas spokesman Sami Abu Suri calls the ceasefire a victory.
We are here today to announce Gaza's victory. We are here today to declare that we have won over this power, the destructive Israeli power. We won first and foremost thanks to God Almighty. Second, thanks to the resilience of our people.
All right, folks, joining us right now as we welcome you back is Alan Dershowitz, Newsmax contributor, author, and professor of law at Harvard Law School. And, of course, his new bestseller, Taking a Stand. It's all about his life in the law and the cases he's covered. Hello, Alan.
Hi, how are you?
Great to talk to you again. All right, look, my heart sank, I got to tell you, when I heard about this ceasefire agreement. What's your take on it?
Well, I'm glad the fighting has stopped. I was in Israel just before it started, and I was taken into one of the tunnels. And as soon as I went and saw the tunnel, which led out just yards away from a kindergarten with 57 children, I knew that Israel would have to go in and take out those tunnels. And they did. I'm glad they took out the tunnels. I'm glad the fighting has stopped. But I guarantee you that this is going to start again in a year or two, because Hamas always loses on the ground and always wins in the court of public opinion. They point to the 2,000 dead people, including a few children, and without the media understanding that all these dead babies are the complete fault of Hamas for using them as human shields, Israel gets blamed, and there'll be a Goldstone Commission report like there was last time. This time a chairman has already been appointed who, before hearing any evidence, has said that Netanyahu belongs in the criminal dock of the criminal court. And so it's a prescription by the international community for telling Hamas, please, please, do it again. If you do it again, if you fire rockets and build tunnels, and Israel responds as it has to, and Israel kills some civilians because you have used them as human shields, then the world will continue to condemn Israel. It's an absolute guarantee that it will start all over again. It's going to be a disaster.
I couldn't agree with you more. And we had Danny Dannon on earlier at the top of the show, former Deputy Defense Minister and, of course, Likud Party member of the Knesset. And why do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu did not take this before the cabinet, who, by the way, would have defeated this ceasefire agreement?
Well, it looks like it would have been at least a tie vote and perhaps a defeat. Look, Netanyahu is a very reluctant warrior. Until this war in Gaza, he was the first prime minister, certainly in recent memory, who never put troops on the ground. He did not want to put troops on the ground. I had dinner with him just a few days before he put the troops on the ground. It was Hamas with the tunnels that made him do it, because you can't destroy these tunnels from the air. So he's a reluctant warrior. He cries every time an Israeli soldier or civilian is killed, and 60-some-odd soldiers, I say soldiers, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids, violinists, students, wonderful future leaders, artists, died in the process. And he didn't want to do that, and he didn't want to see more deaths. And if Israel had actually invaded Gaza and gone in on the ground, there would have been probably hundreds of Israeli deaths and thousands of more Palestinian deaths. So, look, I think myself Israel made a terrible mistake. I didn't think it at the time, but I think now, in not distinguishing between the civilian settlements, which they should have ended in Gaza in 2005. They should have ended the civilian settlements, but they should not have ended the military occupation. I don't know of any country that has ever ended a military occupation while the other side is sending rockets and wanting to destroy your civilians. So they should have kept the soldiers in there. But there's a big difference between keeping soldiers in and putting them back in. And so were I in the cabinet, I probably would have reluctantly voted with Netanyahu for the ceasefire and move the battlefield now from the ground in Gaza to the International Criminal Court, to the United Nations, to the United States. And look, I am very critical, although I supported him and voted for him, very critical of the Obama administration's approach to this war in Israel, telling Israel that it could have done more to avoid civilian casualties. What could it have done more? Should it not have gone in after the tunnels? Should it not have tried to protect its own soldiers? Should it not have responded to rocket attacks? What would the United States do? What is it doing? The United States is now calling for targeted assassination of ISIS members. That's the right thing to do, and that's what Israel has done. So the United States ought to apply the same standard to Israel that it applies to itself, taking into account that Israel's enemies are just a couple of miles away from civilian population centers, where thankfully our enemies are separated by an ocean. But, if there are 100 ISIS members who are Americans with American passports and 200 or 300 who are Europeans with passports, that ocean is not going to protect us. And Hamas is to Israel as ISIS is to the United States.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. I agree with everything you said. But getting back to the ceasefire, the fact of the matter is, they extended the fishing. Just the fact that they gave Hamas an opportunity, even though notwithstanding the damage and notwithstanding the killing of many of their hierarchy and notwithstanding everything that took place, still in all, Hamas gets a chance as they did, and they would ordinarily, but they wanted an opening of the border for the first time now in 6 years or so. They're going to have some of that. They're going to have extended fishing rights. And then in a month, they're going to meet and they're going to discuss even more concessions from Israel. So
well,
I don't get it.
I don't have any problem with making concessions to the civilians of Gaza as to how they make a living with fishing rights and other things, as long as there's an absolute control on no weapons and no concrete being brought in. Remember, they got millions of pounds of concrete from the European community to build buildings and hospitals, and every single one of those pieces of concrete was put into building tunnels.
But they're going to get them again now to rebuild all the infrastructure.
Well, that has to be done under security, and there has to be an absolute assurance that no tunnels will be built. Now, will Abbas send in his own people, and will they be able to monitor it from the Palestinian Authority? Only time will tell. The end result is, like America, Israel can only trust itself, and it can only trust its ability to prevent the tunnels from being rebuilt and the rockets from being refired. But this is a guarantee of a repetition if the international community condemns Israel for the dead civilians rather than Hamas, who deliberately set out to see Israel kill as many Palestinian civilians as possible. And don't believe me on that. Believe the leaders of Hamas who say it to their own people, saying that we use women and children as human shields, as martyrs. They know they do that. They fire their rockets from hospitals, from schools. They hope that Israel will fire back and hit a UN facility. They cheer when that happens.
Absolutely. And I got one more on this, and that is the timing. A 4-year-old girl killed by Hamas rockets. It just seems to me that the admission by Hamas leadership that, yes, they did kidnap the 3 Israeli teenagers, and then to have this, this unilaterally accepted by Netanyahu ceasefire. His poll numbers are tanking in Israel.
No, I know. Look, I think he's a courageous man. He does what he thinks is right. And he has to be a statesman rather than a politician. But what amazes me is that, we're all horrified by the beheading of a journalist. It's just unbelievably cruel. But is it less cruel or more cruel than another American citizen, a 16-year-old schoolboy, being kidnapped and murdered in cold blood? We have to understand that if not for the Israel Defense Forces, Hamas would be just like ISIS.
Absolutely.
And we have to fight Hamas. You cannot negotiate and recognize and legitimate people whose charter says we want to kill every Jew hiding behind every rock because our God has told us to do that. That's in the charter. And as Elie Wiesel said, for him the lesson of the Holocaust is always believe the threats of your enemies more than the promises of your friends. And I think Israel has to live by that, as America would live by that. Just remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union were trying to put missiles 90 miles from our shores. We didn't just say, let them do it. We quarantined, we threatened, and we got them to remove their missiles. And not a single missile was fired, of course, but with Israel, there have been thousands of missiles fired.
Yep. Alan, always great to talk to you, folks. The book, Taking a Stand, make sure you pick it up. We got holidays coming up. Just a fascinating read with all the parts of American history that this man has been involved in by the clients he's represented and the people he's known. It's a great story. And Alan, thank you for coming on again,
my
sir.
pleasure. Thank you so much.
Take care. Alan Dershowitz, ladies and gentlemen, Newsmax contributor here on the Steve Malzberg Show. Yeah, I mean, you know, we agree on some parts. We certainly agree about the inherent evilness of Hamas and what they represent and what they would do if only they had the chance to do it. But there's no way I would have signed that ceasefire. Man, once that 4-year-old girl was killed, once they admitted finally that they kidnapped the Israeli teenagers and killed them, I would have increased the bombing. I would have increased, continued the killing of their leadership as Israel had undertaken. This ceasefire without going to the cabinet was a big mistake by Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think he's going to pay for that mistake, politically speaking, inside of Israel. All right, folks, you know what you love it. You got to have it. It's coming up next. It's Gimme 5. Don't go away.